He's someone you feel long before you understand. Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. From Colombia today. Delicious. How's it going? Good to see you. Heating up over here. Turn off the air conditioning for this review, so wish me luck. Cross my fingers I don't die of heat exhaustion. This is a long one. I recently made the decision to seriously read poetry. I know. To seriously read poetry, or make an attempt. And so I decided to start myself off easy by reviewing the collected poems of Hart Crane. If you're at all familiar with poetry, you're gonna see that was total sarcasm. Hart Crane is generally considered to be one of the most difficult poets out there. Right up there with T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens. Published in various years during the 20s and 30s, but this collection was published in 2001 by the publisher Liverwrite. David Polk, a very kind friend and patron of the show, and poet in his own right, link below, wrote me a very thoughtful message in defense of poetry, as a kind of encouraging spur for me to change my mind, to have another go at it, which I thought was a great idea. I'm flattered he took the time. He's responding to this review I did of Knausgaard's My Struggle Volume 2, wherein I was discussing how Knausgaard didn't get poetry and neither did I. And so he kind of wrote a very cordial defense of it. So I thought that was inspiring. Among other insightful things in his message, he wrote that a poem is not a logical argument. It takes into account what C.G. Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious. I know very little, but I know that Mr. Polk is correct. I've read a few who fall under that category, who possess that power. Milton, Blake, Rimbaud, Baudelaire. But one of the most remarkable examples of a poet I've read who was able to access the wisdom of the unconscious was Hart Crane. With poetry, while it may often be the case that you could appreciate it fully without being educated in it and understanding where things have come from, it seems more so than with other poets, perhaps, knowledge of Hart Crane's background is almost essential to fully appreciate the experience of reading him. And the more you know, the better it seems, in my experience, as he was a very internal poet. Inviting in his evocative lines, almost friendly, but completely impenetrable when it comes to their meaning. Quick intro to Crane. Hart Crane was an American modernist poet who, among other things, wrote about the symbolism of America, the myth, the enormous idea of it, as a country, as an idea, as a concept, as a mythological, titanic collection of identities and folk tales and desires. America as an idea and as an ideal, presenting it in a way that was very powerful. He was inspired by the French poets such as Rimbaud and Baudelaire, as well as by the American poets Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe. And I think to some extent, as Harold Bloom mentions in the introduction, he was sort of begrudgingly in dialogue with T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. In the introduction, Bloom writes, Crane had a more personal project, in renewal of Whitman's, to fuse the myth of America with a realized homoeroticism. In the 1920s, that is no small task. Crane was born in the Midwest, not far from the birthplace of William H. Gass, whose collection of stories I reviewed recently, in the heart of the country. Right, excellent collection of stories. Yeah, William H. Gass, yes, who came later in the 20th century and would also do stunning things with language, certainly influenced, well, I mean, perhaps not influenced, but he knew of Hart Crane. He wrote a wonderful, terrific article about his suicide that I've linked below in the description, called and I'm going to quote from it later in this review, "The Doomed in Their Sinking." That was from a 1972 issue of the New York Review. I believe it was a review of The Savage God by A. Alvarez, which I have not read yet, but I plan to. Also an outsider from what would later come to be called the Rust Belt. But Crane was born when business was booming, back when Detroit was the Paris of the Midwest, right? That's what they used to call it. Being gay in 1920s America, having a love for sailors that was not often returned, as well as drinking like one, Crane had a fantastically chaotic short life, ending it when he jumped from the stern of a ship into the ocean, at the age of only 32, when he was coming back from Veracruz, Mexico, to New York. Crane wrote mostly in free verse and was considered an expert at it, and developed a very challenging and innovative style. It was very serpentine, very labyrinthine, very evocative, but not clear in the slightest. Reading him as a poetic novice is sort of like taking a college kid to his first Tarkovsky film after a lifetime of being raised on Spielberg. The American poet and critic William Logan wrote in a piece about Hart Crane for poetryfoundation.org, "I've always loved Hart Crane, but I love him in fractions. Delighting in half a dozen of those rhapsodic poems long on style and short on sense, but finding the rest mystifying as a Masonic ritual. In some of his best poems I merely admire lines, and in some of those lines I merely admire phrases. And yet what phrases and lines, and, more rarely, what poems he wrote." That's a lot of humbling honesty, and for a guy writing for, poetryfoundation.org, and I am of the same opinion after reading this collection. I'm the same way because Crane is so difficult to comprehend. I like him in certain lines, and it didn't take me long in this collection to, reading him for the first time, it didn't take me long to realize that I was reading somebody who is, who possesses a vocabulary and an ability to juxtapose words to unlock certain emotions or images in one's mind. That is, I began to realize I was reading the work of a man who has a clear and demonstrable ability that is extremely rare among the human race. This guy can do things with words in the English language that very few people can. And it sneaks up on you before you even realize the meaning of the poem. I was actually, the first time I was actually floored by a line. I'll read it to you. It was In Shadow. The poem In Shadow. It's a great introduction by Harold Bloom, by the way. But and we'll get to that. But I read the line In Shadow. Third stanza. Gently yet suddenly the sheen of stars enwraps her parasol. She hears my step behind the green. Twilight stiller than shadows fall. And I'll read you the whole thing. But first, really quick, the executive producer of today's show, the sponsor of today's video, is Ageless Literature. Rare booksellers based out of St. Petersburg, Florida. You've got to check them out. They have a ton of great stuff, including stuff from the Lost Generation. Check them out via the link below. And not only do they sell rare books, but they're also launching the first mobile app for book collectors to learn about rare books, purchase rare books, and share your collections in a way that's never been done before. So if you're interested in curated collectible books and want updates on this new app they're launching, please head over to agelessliterature.com and subscribe to their newsletter. Also, you can get 10% off your order with the code BETTERTHANFOOD. The link is below. Full transparency, if you purchase anything from that site using that code, I shall receive a commission. And it helps support my show, so thank you very much. And many thanks to Ageless Literature for sponsoring the show. Out in the late amber afternoon, confused among chrysanthemums, her parasol, a pale balloon, like a waiting moon, in shadow swims. Her furtive lace and misty hair, over the garden dial distill, the sunlight, them withdrawing, where, again the shadows at her will. Gently yet suddenly the sheen of stars enwraps her parasol, and these two next lines were the ones that got me. She hears my step behind the green, twilight, stiller than shadows, fall. Come, it is too late to risk alone the light's decline, nor has the evening long to wait, but her own words are night's and mine. Gently yet suddenly the sheen of stars enwraps her parasol. She hears my step behind the green, twilight, stiller than shadows, fall. Something about the word choice, tempo, and cadence of those lines just hit a target that was an indication of the depth this guy has, not only conceptually, intellectually, but also just with his knowledge of language and timing. The surface level kind of images that he's tossing my way are almost like they're kind of secondary, right? Where I'm like, because what I'm really interested in is the way that these lines sound and the way he's putting these words together, the kind of colors they evoke, the images, the sensations. And you can tell, if you've read for a while, I think you can tell that who you're dealing with on the other side of that page, right? And when you do, sometimes it's kind of staggering. You're sort of like, oh, shit. This guy was probably the same age as me, but his grasp was so much tighter. Yeah, couldn't tell you. The experience of reading him aloud is very different from the experience of reading him in silence. I prefer the silence because Crane wrote in free verse and tends to rhyme when he wants to, right? It wasn't a requisite for him or his work. it's sporadic and meandering and serpentine, and he is not somebody who I prefer to read aloud. I don't think I would get the same effect reading him aloud that I would. You have to actually look at the words on the page and how they're interacting with one another. You have to see the breaks in the line, right, in order to really feel the full impact, I think. Certain ones could work out loud. I don't know. For me, I prefer the in silence because he did so much with the visual structure of the poem as well, the actual way it looked on the page, right? So, yeah. Those in the know may snicker at this, but yeah, I'm not well versed in poetry. I'm not educated in it in the slightest. Neither am I educated in literature, for that matter. But Hart Crane is one of the most difficult American poets who was ever published. Right up there along with perhaps the most difficult, who's considered the most difficult, which of course you could guess would be T.S. Eliot, whom Crane was not a fan of, per se, but was writing partially in response to, specifically to his magnum opus, The Wasteland, which I read and indeed did not understand, but I've only just read it, not researched. So they were contemporaries, so yeah. Crane was kind of like, in a disgruntled way, responding with his magnum opus, The Bridge, to Eliot's The Wasteland. The Wasteland is a very, well, if you've ever read it, you'll know it's a very odd kind of, I think people call it, they use the term fractured a lot, fractured, bleak, strange, post-war, World War I poem. It's very, very disjointed, multiple voices, confusing, interesting for sure, especially hearing him read it, which you can on YouTube, him and a few different actresses and actors. But it is a schizophrenic poem. It's a very, very odd experience that leaves one feeling kind of saddened and drained, most certainly. There's something very, what's a heavier word than jaded? Like disillusioned, yeah, but even heavier than that. Kind of like morose, almost. Not quite like that gothic or anything. Not quite like drained is the only word that comes to mind after experiencing The Wasteland. Drained and kind of brittle, kind of dry. Yeah, like as if the aftermath of a flood or a war or a bomb going off. Yeah, that poem does get that across, that kind of atmosphere, that sort of tone for the world, in my opinion. But, without really addressing, what the event is that caused him to write the poem, which would be the series of events, the war. It's interesting. He kind of does it indirectly, which is interesting, just sort of like in the nature of what people are saying and how they're behaving. And what he's writing about. We'll talk more about that another time. I may revisit Crane later, perhaps focusing on some of his specific poems like The Bridge, or Voyages, or Passages, his ambitious, monumental synthesis of American myth and his own personal myth, the myth of his life, of his sexuality, of his joie de vivre, which could definitely serve as the subject of an entire video in and of itself. Indeed, this video is going to be very heavily biographical, and it's going to focus a lot on the life of Hart Crane and some of the people he knew and what happened to him, as a way of kind of giving you a full picture, or at least a decent introduction to the man and his work. I hope to paint a very interesting portrait for you to explore further, because this guy is really something. Yeah, his prose can be really like floral and flowery, but man, dude, this guy, this is a dark individual. And but he's also kind of very exuberant, very fiery, very much of the crowd of Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and of course a friend, as we shall speak about, of Harry Crosby, the other American poet who I've been obsessed with recently. My wife actually found a collection of his work in a bookstore in Chattanooga, of all places. It was pretty cool. It's rare-ish, but, and I also picked up his diaries, Shadows of the Sun, back there. So this will be a broad overview of the man, his life, which ended very early, as tends to happen sometimes with genius poets. I don't understand the work of Hart Crane. I don't. Not intellectually, not academically, not emotionally. Few, very few do, including his friends. His friends didn't understand him either. And very few people do entirely. Maybe nobody. Maybe nobody in totality. Nobody walking the globe these days, at least. There may have been one or two sailors out there to really get him, but probably not. Crane preferred sailors. I'm not sure you can quite understand him, or that he wanted to be understood, or that it's something one should try and do after reading his poetry. They are left up to interpretation in a way that is, the mystery is part of their appeal. It's kind of Sphinx-like, right? They're sort of, not quite riddles, but I think somebody's called them Rorschach tests. And I can't remember if that was Waldo Frank or Malcolm Cowley or who, but I think that is the closest thing to an accurate description of the work of Hart Crane. Yeah, they're kind of like Rorschach tests, but with a clear framing theme, you know? Like they're not completely random, but they set up a tone, they set up a note, or a series of notes. You have the frame, you have kind of like the theme, the image you're starting with. And from there, how far he's able to travel in so few lines, so few words, is remarkable. Especially when, you know, coming from somebody who really prefers novels traditionally in his history of reading. It's very impressive how far you can travel in so few lines with the work of Hart Crane. Yeah. Internally, too. How far you can travel internally. How fast you can, too. That's the thing about poetry. Poetry has a real ability to shorten the time. You know, it's, as far as bang for your buck, it's quite good. It's quite accelerated profundity. You know, it's kind of distilled profundity in so many words or lines. It's very impressive when somebody does it right. When somebody does it wrong, of course, we all know. We all have the experience, perhaps it's our own poetry. It's agonizing. But when it's good, and same poem can make you feel two different ways on two different days, you know, which is strange. But this is a very interesting thing, because I've said I don't get poetry, right? Except on some level I must, because it can resonate nonetheless, even when I don't understand it. I love song lyrics. I love Milton, I love Blake, I love Baudelaire, I love Rimbaud. But often, yeah, when it comes to actually discussing poetry, especially modernist poetry, kind of like that guy in the corner that's like, he sticks like words together, I don't know, sound kind of purty. Perhaps you felt the same way. Poets are more or less successful at conjuring these reactions in their readers. Some are trite, falls flat, saccharine, kind of like cringy, you know, is what we would say these days in the vernacular. Some are impressive, some are like godlike, like warlocks. And some, it depends in which context you hear them. In fact, all of them, in my opinion. Poetry is very fragile, right? You can make, especially reading aloud, in a bad reading, you can make just about any poet sound bad, right? You can't make every poet sound good. And some are so unique, so unusual in their approach and performance with language, it really borders on occult magic. You come away perplexed but mesmerized. What did you do there? How did you do it? How do you write like that? How do you think like that, right? You know, I flopped the book down in disgust. Knowing that whatever peculiar inherent genius Crane has for matching word to word is not in my blood. It's not in my construction. I can sense it, I just can't replicate it. Light drowned the lithic trillions of your spawn. Are you fucking kidding me? Who writes like this? Who writes like that? Nobody. Hart Crane was a real symbol of vivacity in the 1920s, of the possibilities therein, the jazz age, New York, and the excitement and excess of a new country with grand ambitions like its denizens. His suicide was a symbol of a country scale come down, right? A globe-sized hangover, and marked the beginning of one of the what would become the worst known period in human history, as far as scale. He worked as an ad man in New York, briefly, but not for long, and not particularly well, according to his friend Malcolm Cowley. In his personality, Crane was apparently known for fits of ecstasy and pits of despair. And he oscillated in these two polarities, right? He loved to dance, but it seems in a kind of darker, cathartic way, he also loved to cry. He had a funny habit of becoming so frustrated with objects that he'd throw them out of windows. He liked throwing things out of second-story windows. Once he sat down enthusiastically to compose a letter in Spanish, right? He'd been learning Spanish, and there was a politician that he and a friend of his were very, very appreciative of, and they wanted to write him a letter in Spanish, right? So they're going to write him a letter in Spanish. And the typewriter that Hart's using won't write in Spanish, right? So he becomes furious, probably drinking quite a bit. So he threw the typewriter out the window. And then he went downstairs and picked it up, and he brought it back upstairs to the second story. Then he threw it out again. Seems to have taken it quite personally. Crane seemed to have wanted to create a mythic, all-encompassing, poetic representation of America, using, amongst many other things, the Brooklyn Bridge as the monolithic metaphor of this vast idea, this vast machine of a country. He wrote, "I'm on a synthesis of America and its identity called the Bridge," right? And the poem is included in this collection. American billboard advertising, Atlantis, Rip Van Winkle, Pocahontas, all these things find their way into the slipstream of Crane's imagery in the Bridge. He wanted to create a transcendent ideal, a symbolic monument in the world of poetry, like the Brooklyn Bridge was a symbolic monument of fortitude in America. He wanted to create something that represented these possibilities, the possibilities of not only being something great, but being something transcendent, sublime, and ideal, something that could be better, and not only better, but the best, right? This was back in a time when poets loved America, in spite of its problems, you know? I'm not sure that Crane succeeded, right? When I read The Bridge, I don't know. I have no confidence in my opinion. I suppose it depends on who you ask, but the poem eventually was finished, and we are still talking about it, and it is almost 100 years later. It seemed very difficult for him, and it took some time. While working on it in the 20s, he went to go stay with his friends in France, the fatalistically romantic and doomed poet Harry Crosby and his wife Caresse, at their countryside mill in France, outside of Paris, where there was a great deal of partying. The Crosbys started the Black Sun Press, which published Hart Crane early on. "He is of the sea, as I am of the sun," as Harry said. Killing himself 2 years before Crane, Harry was disturbingly accurate in his assertion. Crane and Rimbaud are two primary examples of outrageously precocious, self-destructive gay poets. Both had flings with women. Crane with his friend's wife. Their marriage was going downhill, so it wasn't quite that bad, but, you know. And Rimbaud with women in Africa. I don't know if he got together with any in France, but he went on to become an arms dealer, running guns in... as well as other items of trade in Africa, notoriously, in one of the most incredible stories ever told, which was true. My favorite poem in this collection actually differs dramatically in tone from the celestial heights of the Bridge. It's actually a decadent, tropical Gothic, almost funereal dirge entitled "O Carib Isle," with an exclamation point. And I'll read it to you. It's in the section entitled Key West, which is right after the Bridge, and which I, at least on first read, enjoyed more than the Bridge, actually. O Carib Isle by Hart Crane. The tarantula rattling at the lily's foot, across the feet of the dead, laid in white sand, near the coral beach, nor zigzag fiddle crabs, side stilting from the path that shift, subvert, and anagrammatize your name. No, nothing here, below the palsy that one eucalyptus lifts, in wrinkled shadows, mourns. And yet suppose I count these nacreous frames of tropic death, brutal necklaces of shells around each grave squared off so carefully. Then, to the white sand I may speak a name, fertile, albeit in a stranger tongue, tree names, flower names, deliberate, gainsay death's brittle crypt. Meanwhile, the wind that knots itself in one great death coils and withdraws, so syllables want breath. But where is the captain of this doubloon isle without a turnstile? Who but catchword crabs patrols the dry groins of the underbrush? What man or what is commissioner of mildew throughout the ambushed senses? His Carib mathematics web the eye's baked lenses. Under the poinciana of a noon or afternoon, let fiery blossoms clot the light, render my ghost, sieved upward, white and black along the air, until it meets the blue's comedian host. Let not the pilgrim see himself again, for slow evisceration bound like those huge terrapin, each daybreak on the wharf, their brine-caked eyes, spiked, overturned, such thunder in their strain, and clenched beaks coughing for the surge again. Slagged of the hurricane, I, cast within its flow, Congeal by afternoons here, satin and vacant. You have given me the shell, Satan, carbonic amulet, seer of the sun, exploded in the sea. Rimbaud in Key West, no? Apparently he wrote it after visiting his aunt in Cuba. There's so much going on in that last stanza. Especially with that last line. Of course, those of you who know me probably know, like, that I'm going to be into that poem just because, you know, Rimbaud's whole thing, you know, the sun, eternity, the sun matched with the sea. That whole vision of the sun setting on the ocean, looking out and seeing the white blend with the white of the reflection off the ocean and looking into eternity. So, yeah, I love that stuff. Yeah, apparently there are tarantulas in Florida and Cuba. I had to look that up. I didn't know that. There are also myriads of black crabs in mangrove swamps that I discovered recently. And they like to climb trees like spiders. They're kind of hideous and fascinating. I mean, those two words certainly sum up Florida in general. It's my favorite state. Turns out Harry Crosby loved this poem too. This is unsurprising. He was obsessed with the sun. This is from my Patron-Only review of Harry Crosby's biography, Black Sun by Geoffrey Wolff, which is linked below if you want to check it out. I highly recommend it. It's the best biography I have ever read. And this is a piece from it, talking about Hart Crane's time with him and Caress at the mill in France. Referring to Harry Crosby, Wolff writes, "And nothing Crane did managed to estrange Harry from him. He is of the sea, as I am of the sun," Harry wrote, describing Crane's poetic preoccupation and foretelling his death. Crane fought with shopkeepers up and down the streets of Amelville. Harry smiled. Crane invited a chimney sweep to share his bed in the white-rugged, white-walled, white-quilted guest room at 19 Rue de Lille, and the fellow left his hand and footprints on every surface, ruining the room. Harry and Caress endured. Caress found him dynamite to handle, and when one night, during a return from the mill to Paris with Constance Coolidge, he demanded that Auguste stop the voisin so that he could piss at the headlights, she bit her lip and remembered what she had taught herself about the glories of the poet and the miseries of conventions and manners. Crane held his belly when he laughed, and he laughed often. He was generous within the limits of his means, giving Caress a necklace and Harry a pair of moccasins he had bought from a sailor. One day, he gave them both the manuscript copy of one of his finest poems, O Carib Isle, which Harry, with his fondness for rank, declared one of the 5 best poems of our generation. Like most of Crane's verse, it is elliptical and inward, taking its life from a private symbolic system. Also, it is a poem about death, so that it is tempting, in regard to the surfaces of the two poets' work, to reach for similarities. But Crane, however elusive his conceits and however misbegotten his attempt in The Bridge to counteract what he perceived to be Eliot's nihilism in The Wasteland, was forever rooting for something substantial, a correspondence between dreams and their objective provocations, whereas Harry's verse is truly rootless. Yeah, it seems that Crane is obviously kind of vying for something positive, for lack of better terms, in his oeuvre. You know, something he's vying for, to use a couple terms from Polya. Even though he's wrapped up in the Dionysian, Crane is shooting for the Apollonian, undoubtedly. Undoubtedly, he would like to be. He would most love to be on the side, spearheading the Apollonian myth of America. But his nature is so mired in the Dionysian that he slips into the same realm as Harry, and perhaps even further in some respects. But upon reading O Carib Isle and reacting to it, Harry celebrated Crane's own derangement of the senses, a calculated derangement they shared with Rimbaud, whom they both idolized. He wrote the author of O Carib Isle, "Hart, what thunder and fire for breakfast! Some day when we are all dead, they will be screaming and cutting each other's throats for the privilege of having it. I am no critic, but I know gold when I see it. You write from impulse and imagination, not by rules. Everyone should, of course, but they simply don't. We'll give them hell." It's a very Hemingway line at the end. And the next line is about how Crane tried to seduce Harry's chauffeur. So, yeah, interesting guy. Yeah, I appreciated Wolff's insight into Crane's construction of poetry and his work with like this personal symbolic system, which Harry had his own as well. Of course, again, he was obsessed with the sun. It all kind of revolved around the sun. I think every artist does have their own symbolic system, so to speak, but yeah, Crane's was more private, perhaps, than many others. Yeah, that is my favorite of the lot, I think. I just don't find a lot of poetic material that juxtaposes death, despair, and ruin in a place brimming with sunlit positivity, you know? So when I find something like that with those contrasts, something of that variety, you know, I always move towards it. I always like to find the overlapping, merging points of light and darkness, right? The gray area and the crepuscular, sublime space that opens on that border and that overlap. And the comedian host of the blue, right? Which blue is he referring to? Is he referring to the blue above or the blue below? Zeus or Poseidon? Also from Black Sun. Like Harry, Crane believed that poetry was magic and could be trapped only by recourse to magic, a black alchemy of self-induced exaltation. The trick, as both he and Harry knew, was not infinitely replicable. And as the poet and the trick became indivisible, when the trick failed, the poet would vanish in smoke. That's the best argument for writing what you need to write when you're young and not waiting, because it's not infinitely replicable. Your experience is not infinitely replicable. And to already know that at the age of 35 is saying something. It goes fast, is all I'm saying. And the fire is not always with you. I wouldn't count on it being around. I wouldn't wait until you're ready. Yeah. To think you're reading the same words of these men of poetic genius who took their own lives, you know, that's the thing about poetry. It's an incantation. You're literally communicating with the dead. You know, when you read those lines out loud from Harry Crosby or Hart Crane, you're reading lines exactly the way they were in their mouths. You can guarantee it, that they said the same words that you're saying. There's something about that dialogue, about that renewal, about that communication that stretches, you know, there's something about that thread, right? Back into history. It's very ghostly. It's kind of haunting. As if you were to repeat the same words, perhaps you'd understand the same things, which means you would feel the same things, which perhaps would lead you to the same fate, or one similar. Disturbing, you know. You're speaking in a very personalized, twisted, occult language, with a very personal, symbolic system of these poets at the center of all of it. It's weird. Yeah, at the mill they set him up with a carton of, I think, of Cutty Sark. There's actually a section in the book called Cutty Sark, I think in reference to this. It's a whiskey that Crane loved. Crane was a very, very heavy drinker. He'd write listening to the phonograph, either playing Ravel's Bolero or Bessie Smith. I think D.H. Lawrence actually hated that Bessie Smith record so much because he was hanging around the mill too with his wife. His wife, Lawrence's wife, loved the record and she kept playing it. And I think one day D.H. Lawrence got so pissed that he broke the record over her head. D.H. Lawrence was frankly kind of a prick. I don't really like him, but you know. Eventually Crane overstayed his welcome and instead of writing the bridge, tried to seduce Harry's chauffeur. He was a total mess at this point and onwards. Of course, there's a lot of his life, his earlier life that I've left out, but this was the most interesting portion for me. But yeah, he was a total mess at this point. But he often was. His hair had already gone gray in his 20s. You know, he drank too much. While the Crosbys were very supportive, obviously, he still couldn't finish the bridge there, but later would. Harry eventually killed himself along with his lover in a New York hotel in 1929. Again, Harry was obsessed with the sun. The gun he used even had a sun engraved on it. Crane dedicated a poem to Harry that he wrote a couple months after his death, entitled, appropriately, To the Cloud Juggler, which is also in the Key West section. To the Cloud Juggler, in memoriam, Harry Crosby. What you may cluster around the news of space, we hold in vision only, asking trace, of districts where cliff, sea, and palm advance, the falling wonder of a rainbow's trance. Your light lifts whiteness into virgin azure. Disclose your lips, O sun, nor long demur. With the snore of thunder, crowding us to bleed, the green preemption of the deep seaweed. You, the rum giver to that slide by night, the moon's best lover, guide us by a sleight of quartz to faithfuls surely smuggled home, as you raise temples fresh from basking foam. Expose vaunted validities that yawn, Past pleasantries assert the ripened dawn, as you have yielded balcony and room, or tempests in a silver floating plume. Wrap us and lift us, drop us, then returned, like water undestroyed, like mist unburned. But do not claim a friend like him again, whose arrow must have pierced you beyond pain. Excuse me. Didn't expect that. I'm kind of fucking dying over here. You know, this is really fucked up. It is like magic. It's weird. You don't know what's working on you when it is. You know, yeah. I wish I could write a poem like that for my friends if they died. Oh, it's like you can only, stay strong for so long and then he just gets in there or something. I don't even know. That came out of fucking nowhere. It's crazy. It's like being seized by something. Excuse me. I didn't cry reading that whole thing. I didn't cry the entire time. Maybe it's just because I'm paying more attention to it now, like trying to get it all right or something. No, it's just remembering wild nights with wild characters when I was younger. It just becomes so different later on. My friends are still alive too, you know. I don't have anything to complain about. It's just some stories are just very, very sad. Some stories are very sad. The first time Hart Crane tried to kill himself, he failed. He was embarrassed. He thought he looked like a fool, right? Which just further solidified his ambition to end his life that much more, right? In the years leading up to his death, Crane had drank so much that he wasn't able to write as well as he'd been able to previously. He'd destroyed his poetic gift, drowned it, you might say. And yeah, on a trip back to New York from Veracruz, Mexico, with Malcolm Cowley's wife, whom Crane was seeing at the time, Crane suddenly jumped off the stern into the ocean and was never seen again. Hart Crane's father, whom he had a very contentious relationship with, although they made up before his father died, was a self-made millionaire candy producer. You won't believe which candy he was responsible for creating. The Lifesaver. The irony is staggering and grim. If one somehow finds the gesture romantic, though, always remember what William H. Gass wrote about suicide, referencing Crane in the same essay. Death will not fill up an empty life, and in a line of verse it occupies only 5 letters of space. Hart's life wasn't empty. Neither was his glass, unfortunately. It's not like his friends didn't try to help him, you know. Malcolm Cowley tried to do it indirectly. He tried to get him to move from the, as he put it, Cowley, the literature of ecstasy to the literature of wisdom. Crane saw right through the intellectual intervention. And Cowley mentioned that Crane wrote Waldo Frank saying, first dismissing any kind of improvement in health, he said, "Give me the nihilism of the will." But then alcohol is a very tricky beast like that, which I've discussed before, because by imperceptible shades of movement, it gradually wins you over on its side so that it kind of pervades every single facet of your life and personality, so that you'll actually go to great lengths to keep drinking it, and you won't even know it. It takes a few years, but it can happen, especially if you enjoy it. So if you drink, you know, be careful. I'm taking the year off, and it's been going great so far. Actually, I can recommend it highly. But you do you, you know. We have enough examples of where it goes, but you know, that's, you know, I'm not saying that's you, you know. But it could be. So if you suspect you're going in the wrong direction, you know, maybe it's time for a break. Nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, there's a lot of very good things about it. So, stuff to consider. My attraction to Hart Crane is due to his madness. He has the same kind of visionary seer quality that Rimbaud had. William Blake, too. His behavior was as unruly and outrageous as his talent. He was an impenetrable artist and an impenetrable personality, though he had many friends who spoke very highly of him. One poet he reminded me of, and whom he addresses in his poem The Tunnel, but which I don't hear mentioned much as an influence, was Edgar Allan Poe. Come to think of it, they shared not a dissimilar fate, exacerbated most certainly by drink. Speaking about poetry is very difficult not only because of my lack of knowledge, which is obvious, but Also because of the type of poetry I'm drawn to, which is dense, serpentine, distorted, heavily metaphorical, and far more readily felt than logically understood or comprehended. It's very different from narratives and novels, which are more my comfort zone, right? Poetry is not easy for me. It's not what I prefer, typically. It's hard for me to find poets that I enjoy. Hart Crane is certainly one of them, because he's so fucking mysterious and moving, obviously. Kind of tends to surprise me. But maybe you find yourself in this position as I do, of being a poetic novice. Well, take it from me, I don't know, like earlier on, like it's not, it can surprise you. Like you can think you're not being moved by it. I didn't think I was. Fucking look at me, I'm a goddamn mess. I can barely talk, my nose is all fucking stuffed up with mucus, and you ought to sit with it for a little while and see what kind of effect it has on you. If you like song lyrics, you can understand poetry. If you're moved by song lyrics, if music can make you cry, my theory is that you can most certainly get into poetry. I don't know if you want to. It's not exactly the most like dignified or masculine look, obviously, but it's an option. For the poetic novice, the most striking thing, in my experience of first reading Hart Crane at the age of 35, is the vocabulary and placement of words to mimic physical sensation, along with the recurring nautical motifs foreshadowing his grim aquatic fate. His friends speak of him as though he were bipolar, sensitive and tender with fits of exuberance, but then of madness, right? Again, throwing things out of second-story windows. Yeah, that typewriter. Crane didn't like machines, I gather. I don't think he trusted them. The poet Derek Wolcott, in the documentary I've linked below, referring to Crane's poem For the Marriage of Faustus and Helen, said that he knew that the Faustian part of man, the doomed part of man, is the machine. Prescient, no? But machines or otherwise, Hart Crane apparently loved throwing shit out windows. And listening to the phonograph while he composes poetry. Loud. Very loud. While drinking, of course. If he hadn't been such an astounding poetic genius, he wouldn't have been tolerated for 2 minutes. From the sounds of it, he was an absolute prima donna. I don't think I would have liked him in person. It's certainly possible to know Crane better than I, but whether it's possible to know him entirely, or at least as fully as we seem to be able to know other authors, seems dubious. He's someone you feel long before you understand. Even his friends and colleagues didn't understand him, but they felt him. Waldo Frank called this work magic in the documentary below. Again, there's that word, right? Bloom has referred to him as Orphic, suggesting he's akin to the mythical figure Orpheus, descending into the underworld to capture back love, Eurydice, from the realm of death. Except Crane reminds me of the Cocteau film Orphée, and his death-drive suicidal lust for seas and sailors immediately conjures images of Kenneth Anger's Fireworks, with the stylized gang rape by sailors, right? It seems to me there's an extremely strong connection between the films of Kenneth Anger and the poetry of Hart Crane, for sure. Chaotically sensual, impenetrable but totally recognizable on some unconscious level, unknown but certainly felt, emotionally caustic, sumptuous but raging, erratic and threatening to self-destruct in a beautiful blaze. Perhaps that blaze could have only been extinguished by the ocean. What is so amazing about reading Crane is his demonstration of communicating a totally idiosyncratic, complex, and mysterious style entirely his own in so few words. So few words. Usually to get a feel for an author in fiction, as you well know, if you're watching the show, one has to sit with them for a while to get a feel for them, right? To get a feel for their style. Who's behind the words, right? Who's behind the linear plotline narrative. But it seems like Hart Crane communicates this in like 10 seconds or less, simply through word choice and juxtaposition. I mean, it's sorcery, So yeah, he is truly intentionally opaque, impenetrable. Why read him then? Because what he does to the images in your head when you read the words he placed next to each other on the page can be marvelous. And because we get the sense that within his lines, behind them, below them, there are powerful intentions that, if understood, if finally grasped, yield powerful ideas. You get that feeling, even if it's not the truth. And that feeling sometimes can spur the imagination, can elicit states of mind that are productive in a very impressive way. What is obvious is that Hart Crane constructed a vocabularic arsenal for deployment in a single crucial moment, like a sniper, when the exact word, rhythm, and cadence is a bullseye, eliciting the intended reaction, perhaps illicit. Reaction is the appropriate word because he would sometimes take things from science and psychology as well as Shakespeare. Hart Crane was kind of an alchemic American mystic, right? Again, in Black Sun, referring to Harry's relationship with Cartier-Bresson and Bresson's concern with the moment, the photographic moment, the moment the photograph is taken. Harry, too, was obsessed by the decisive moment. All poets are. All of them. Especially the ones who kill themselves, undoubtedly. This is a recurring motif I've noticed. The ideal moment and timing, right? The sum of everything in a single moment, or a single image, note, phrase, line, whatever. The notion of the totality summed up in the singular, right? The singular moment. Total ecstasy, right? Crane has several unusual stylistic methods. Sometimes there's rhyme, sometimes there's not. Sometimes the line breaks not only in mid-sentence, but also in mid-word. There's occasionally no punctuation at the end. Things are capitalized and go nowhere, or just kind of like sit there and let you drift in the wherever they go. He's an odd one. It's not so extreme that it's like obnoxious. It's just very unusual and very, very specific, very intentional, all of it. All the punctuation or lack thereof and the line breaks and everything, very, very intentional. And it's interesting to just look at it because knowing that there was this very specific intention, you kind of, it invites you to ask why, right? So within that, you get this kind of tone or atmosphere. And they're different. The poems differ in tone and atmosphere, but not greatly. You can tell that it was all certainly the same person writing them. But yeah, it's interesting to watch the evolution too. What seems mutually agreed upon in critics of Hart Crane's work is that Crane's earlier work had a kind of optimism. And as we approach his death, we see that things descend. And that's represented, like I said, in O Caribile, for sure. That's the kind of definitive indication that we're on the decline. Harry Crosby's suicide in 1929, I imagine, only exacerbated his struggle with what was already a crippling addiction to alcohol. It certainly may have confirmed his own intentions and desires as well. As the poet Richard Howard says in the documentary I've linked below, it wasn't only a capacity for disorder, it was an appetite. I think Crane was actually with Harry's mother, planning on meeting up with him that evening in New York on the day that Harry killed himself. So, pretty bad. Like the Japanese poet and novelist Yukio Mishima, like Crane's friend Harry Crosby, friend of Ernest Hemingway, who, like all of the aforementioned, would do the same, Crane wrote the end of his own life story. The poignant question to be asked by us as readers, reading all of these men, and there's a few women too, Wolff, Plath, for sure. The poignant question to be asked is, can you physically save a person like that and keep their writing in all of its power and resonance? Can you take a half-mad poet and remove the suicidal drive from him without extinguishing the flame that drove him to write like that in the first place? And I'm afraid of the answer, which I honestly don't know. Better than food. Rest in peace, Hart Crane. It was risky doing this review. Well, obviously for reasons that I didn't anticipate, but yeah. Because I'm not confident in myself speaking about poetry, But I decided if it gets Crane to you faster, all the better, right? We can always return to him and more of his poems later, when I get the chance. I suspect I'll be reading this collection for many years to come, so yeah. Yeah, better than food, I'm telling you. Obviously I was very moved. It's a good introduction to getting back into poetry, so it's good to be back. It's good to be back. Yeah. We can all be men and read poetry and lose control of our emotions together. Yes. Here, here. I'm not really selling it, am I? Coffee time. And if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to do the coffee jar and show myself some other time. So if you'd like to know how all of this works and the Patreon thing and supporting the show and all of that, I really do appreciate it. And you can go watch any of my other videos, but right now I'm a little worn out and it doesn't really feel right. So thank you very much to all my patrons and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Hayden B. that is going to be a very good fit, I think. Thank you very much, Hayden. Really appreciate it. Hope you're doing well, buddy. Hayden's a good friend. You're going to receive the collected poems of Hart Crane, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And I hope you love both, man. Cheers. Always remember, bring a book wherever you go. All right. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Speak to you soon. Ciao.